That is, everything is controlled by these elites. They control everything?
Yes, but they are only exploited instruments themselves. Most of the time they don't even know this, because they are only held in half-knowledge. Only the heads of the elites know what the digital nobility and their deeply initiated moral blood relatives are doing here on Earth. The digital nobility, which used to secure its power primarily through religious influence, now legally owns everything. Because through its moral blood relatives it has legally imposed trade and maritime law on the whole world and the people living in it. And hardly anyone is aware of the legal consequences and repercussions this has had for centuries. The heads of the elites were then given this superiority because capitalism was better able to keep our civilization under control at this point of development than religion. After the so-called apocalypse, however, this sort of semi-knowing capitalist elite is then disposed of by the club and the digital nobility and presented as villains and dark ages. The plans of the club and the nobility are to then introduce a kind of socialism based on the free provision of all goods, commodities and services. This will be implemented through robotization and artificial intelligence. This is possible because the technologies have of course long since been in the drawer, and because everything comes directly from the club itself. In other words, everything is played into people's brains as ideas, so it is less suspicious. This is supposed to be the golden age, which was always promised in prophecies, myths and esotericism, but even these ancient promises were of course just fake influences of club, digital nobility and AI, nothing more. The people should feel comfortable in the system then existing. There will be great technological digital leaps in development, but there should also be total surveillance and lack of freedom. Carrot and stick.
That is incredible. We can talk about that even more extensively in a moment. Now I would like to come back to the media. Media control everything and dominate public opinion completely?
Yes, they make the issues. For various reasons, people today are no longer in a position to criticize, question or influence the opinion-forming media. Because the media dominance with that public relations work has entrenched itself in all areas of life and established itself there. But that is not the only thing that creates the sovereignty of opinion. Without people knowing it, everyone helps, consciously or unconsciously, to spread and advance the oppressive opinions and schools of thought. Because the substances from the food that work in people's bodies help and support the creation of mental and physical attitudes in them that prevent clear and objective thinking. Their thinking mechanisms and their psychic judgment are attacked and reprogrammed almost without will, so that their subconscious mind functions in such a way that people develop many atypical behaviors. These substances cause fears, 84 adaptive behavior and subordination strategies to develop much more quickly. They join hierarchical opinions, avoid giving contradictions in their profession and environment to generally propagated views and traded doctrines. In order not to cause a stir, they do almost everything to remain and belong. In short, they are or become completely controllable due to their dependence on the overall civil construct, become powerless, and finally generate cool, stubborn beings who serve the system and their directions compliantly. Almost always without consciously noticing it themselves. Most people who find themselves on the treadmills of civilization, however, do not want to hear anything about their enslavement to the system, mainly because of its imprint and the predominantly positive feelings for it. The people who can still think along and still want to make a difference resign. Even people who escape the treadmill and could really change something are prevented by the external system conditions from changing something fundamentally. Due to the mass of the mainstream, They cannot effectively compete with the system in which all people live. Based on this insight, they usually have no desire or strength to fight such battles on the side. And oh, what the heck? Just think to yourself, everything is not that bad after all. It would be counterproductive anyway to get involved in anything, to turn against the uniform opinion of the public. Sadly, these people are actually quite right. Because the fact that something changes in this way compared to the conventional conditions is really hopeless.
So we are stuck.
Yes, what remains is frustration, which at most is expressed here and there in the applause of embarrassing appearances of oh-so-resistant comedians on television, whereby even they are not allowed to say everything, often know very little themselves and thus misdirect their audience, because as comedians they simply cannot or do not want to add up 1 and 1. It is actually horrifying to watch this whole machinery of stupefying people, how the purpose of some cabaret performances or satirical programs is just to let the air out, so that people can at least feel as if they had shown it to the rulers, if only in words. What people watching such satirical programs hardly notice is that such programs subtly support the confirmation of some other so-called truth or subtly push a new direction or way of thinking in support of the status quo. And people do not notice it.
So people are stupid sheep chewing on each other?
No, not really. They are poisoned, manipulated, and misguided, and also under a kind of hypnosis, which not even the alternative media know anything about. A hypnosis that makes it difficult for them to see truthfully. In summary, people are vulnerable to any kind of further influence and manipulation through the food they shovel into themselves, the proclaimed objective science, the frame economic and product manufacturing machinery, the media, and the numerous policy controlling organizations, as well as through their own opinion, which has established itself in their minds as seemingly their own gained truth and has been accepted as confirmed. Strangely determined people. Also because they can only half perceive the developments taking place due to the necessity of running along in the hamster wheel of civilization and then simply want to push through what sounds uncomplicated and, at first glance, very good and logical to them. The underhanded opinion in turn makes them a very subordinate tool of the elites, without noticing the deception behind it or understanding the mechanism behind it, and then they fight with all their conviction, all their hatred, all their anger, and thus exercise direct or indirect violence against the opponents they have been shown. The main thing for such people of justice is that they feel as if they can claim to have destroyed something negative and that they are on the right, the good side. And they do this above all because they think they are acting out of their own conviction, and because it is good to be good, to belong. The so-called opponents of these people also feel they are in the right. They feel discredited, cheated, and subjugated by the world and by people who express the opinion that is generally considered good. The so-called opponents show that their opinion is suppressed in the media, they are being beaten up, and justice and democracy are being trampled underfoot. And with that, the real goal has been achieved, to build up 2 or more blocks that will destroy each other. That will help the coming chaos immensely. And none of them realize that it is all about creating chaos and destruction. They don't realize who the real opponents and producers of their dispute are. Instead, they all just become the executive instrument of aliens, elites, and lackeys. It shows in a sad way how much people today are controllable, mostly because of personal psychological feelings, neuroses, psychoses, complexes, disadvantages, neglect, etc. From childhood, youth, and adulthood, in order to generate actionism, whereby people then unconsciously blame other people for their own suffering. In the form of projection and transmission. This aspect plays an essential role in the mobilization of the respective population or opinion strata. It is no wonder that the anonymous structures of the world imposed on us give rise to such problems between people. For we humans are evolutionarily and psychosocially not created for such an anonymously functioning world. The imposition of a civilization that creates anonymous and psychosocially unnatural worlds of encounter for people is not adapted to us. However, the club kills two birds with one stone, because a highly complex and therefore automatically anonymous civilization must exist in order to produce high technology in an intelligent species. The interpersonal and social problems that arise in this civilization can then be used by the club to carry out further social steering processes. Well, what I actually want to say is that the construction of our propagated togetherness within this anonymously constructed world with its existing patterns of work and life is extremely harmful to the tribal creature man. But a high-tech development, which can make the digitalization of a species possible in the first place, always requires such a form of civilization, which in the process always generates a variety of pathological psychosocial problems. But there is actually another way, as the spiritual species in space prove. Well, now I'm a bit off.
So people help the system voluntarily, through their own civilizing training, without being able to deduce the reasons or causes behind it. I can imagine that when you hear all this for the first time, you can't believe that we humans have so many problems because of these listed influences.
Yes, the agitated, mentally unstable people who are irritated by the world around them cannot see exactly what is going wrong in detail. Not even the so-called intellectuals, they are even deeper in the deception, because they get their so-called education exclusively from the controlled system. Through arrogant conviction that their education is objective and therefore genuine, these people are completely indoctrinated and themselves a means of control, extras of this spectacle. This is a good way to describe this state of affairs. The people have been presented with a great theater play in which they all play amateur actors. And they interpret the faked spectacle as irrationally as the audience of a cinema film, if they accept the reality presented during the film in order to experience the story of the film realistically. It is the same with people today. They do not want to and can no longer recognize the imposed reality with its many deceptions, incitements, and dangers. They believe they live in a world that is just the way it is because there is no other way to do it. They can only watch. They are just consumers. And they really do consume everything. They can be turned on anything. They consume all kinds of rubbish. They run after the absurd and degrading television formats as if nothing else existed. They watch these formats because the substances in their bodies additionally change their psyche, have made them lethargic, anxious, and socially incapable people. Sometimes even to blaspheme and to be disrespected in order to compensate for their own destabilized psyche. But that is not all. It is also the socialization and social situation of people in this civilization. Growing up in predominantly anonymous, socially superficial and cold life structures is not natural for our species. People today learn unnatural behavior and thought structures that do not correspond to their innate biological social patterns. This means that the current civilization structure, which was imposed on us by the club and the digital nobility for our technical development, does not fit our social interaction, our innate psychosocial biology, tribal life. However, people are made to believe that they themselves are to blame for all the misery that arose during the development of civilization. In reality, however, this is merely a reaction to the incompatibility of these civilization structures with the human psyche, mind and biology.
The television formats are truly a big problem. Whether it is about talent, beauty, exclusion and whatever else. Okay, so that was some means of controlling the system, but there are still some components missing.
Right, the banking, financial and economic system and its influence on the money and interest-based creation of credit is another essential part of system control and steering. The resulting inflation and growth compulsion, the forced willingness to work, the interest rate spiral, the crises, uprisings and wars constructed from them to stabilize their own countries already occupied by the elites and to destabilize countries yet to be subjugated, are part of the control which is kept going and fed by the greed of a few people. Arranged by elites who carry out the plan of predetermined destabilization for the biological digitalization of humanity in the service of nobility and club.
And how do these economic and financial mechanisms interact? How do they create control and problems for people?
Mainly through war, decomposition, disease, economic attacks, propaganda or humanitarian relief operations. But also secret weapons, such as weather weapons, which mainly control poor but resource-rich areas of the world. So much is being done by economic power and money interests that it would make everyone sick if he could play a mice in the plans of these death dealers. Targeted dependency on resource-rich states and countries, especially in Africa, through perfidiously set up systems, campaigns, installed wars, uprisings, attacks, diseases, and then their own aid organizations. Which is why hardly anyone in the world clearly sees how the installed crisis system works through war, staged or instigated uprisings by means of those aid organizations or so-called humanitarian missions. Through the worldwide practice of sympathy and superficial help, a positive propaganda is created in our media about this and a corresponding picture of the situation on the ground that the viewer cannot assume that the hidden founders of those aid organizations are the same elitist circles that created the situation on the ground in the first place. Organizations that have so obviously taken up the cause of helping. It is almost presumptuous, on the other hand, when these terrible facts are presented in the media in such a way that the hidden elites behind the misery are not tracked down, but people in the industrialist nations think that they are basically responsible for the misery in Africa because they consume the raw materials, and therefore must feel personally responsible for it through media campaigns and science. People who, to calm their conscience, then sign a monthly contract for a sponsorship with a child in Africa and believe that they have done something good with it. Of course, this is basically a benevolent, good-hearted act. But what really needs to be done instead to stop people in Africa from starving and suffering is obvious. Courage with others to uncover all these hidden things. To want to console oneself with a sponsorship is self-congratulatory deception. This is the reaction of a half-hearted, lazy and not really responsible human being. A human being who only wants to settle the guilt that has been forced upon him with pseudo-help and pseudo-engagement. One should not do such things just to feel better. Because the normal average human being is not to blame for what happens here, nobody. All he has to do is recognize the system, expose it publicly and act against it. In other words, do something about it and refuse to let it continue. It will be this courage that counts in the end, when things go haywire, and what will be rewarded with the freedom and improvement of the world.
What about control through energy?
Yes, that is another subject in itself. So, another part of this control system is the apparent resource dependency on oil, petrol, and the cost-intensive production of electricity. The dependence on oil and the complicated and expensive production of electricity are deliberate because global corporations, the energy cartels, profit from them. These cartels dominate and manipulate the energy supply of the world market, and for decades for monetary, monopoly and control reasons have undermined progress in the development of other, more efficient methods of energy production, notably nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion, an energy with an eerie-sounding name, partly due to a deliberate lack of advertising and education in the media. Many therefore consider nuclear fusion to be just as dangerous as nuclear fission, and out of ignorance confuse it with it in principle. If you ask people about it, they seldom know what it is, let alone can answer that it is an energy source that is so cheap, extremely clean and so efficient and effective that no one on this planet even has to pay for it. Just as unknown is that it would take only a few nuclear fusion reactors in the world to supply the whole of humanity with energy without limits and free of charge. In all technical fields, all around. Unfortunately, few people have any idea what infinite energy, which is available free of charge and infinitely for everyone, would mean for every individual. Hardly anyone is aware of the technological development potential that this holds in all disciplines. The traditional monetary, economic and financial sector, which sucks people dry, would then be practically superfluous or extremely in need of reform and would inevitably be dismantled. This makes it clear that club and nobility are the immediate reason why nuclear fusion is not getting off the ground. After all, of course, the energy cartels are not causally controlled by any elite, but ultimately always by the club and digital nobility. Nuclear fusion is sabotaged. It will only come when, after the catastrophes that are to be initiated, control over humanity has been tightened very firmly. Take a look at the reports about test nuclear fusion reactors in the media. Never before has there been such a hopeful aspect of development that has proceeded so lazily and calmly. Thin and brittle are the reports about it, weak and unmotivated are the works on it. Lousy are the excuses for the alleged lack of progress, that every attentive person can see the intent of the abduction.
And what about green energy production then? Isn't that something progressive for mankind? Doesn't it also have development potential?
For the energy cartels, the media application of green technologies for electricity generation is merely a means of continuing to control energy production and supply. By distracting from or blocking the feasibility of revolutionary alternative energy production methods, such as nuclear fusion, in the media. And this works because green energy technology usually has a positive effect on the average human being. Because it is supposedly clean, it creates new jobs and it is something people have always wanted to enforce. Green energy is not really clean. If you look at the production and maintenance costs for wind turbines, for example. It does not create new jobs either. It is just a long-term redistribution of jobs and the creation of other training occupations. This alone makes these technologies the most expensive energy production methods ever. But it is precisely this very labor and cost-intensive technology that is very useful for the elite in other respects. It generates new credit money in this way, and the collapse of the economic and financial mafia can thus be delayed a little longer for the club until the envisaged date of the apocalypse. Above all, however, it can be used to suppress genuine alternatives and revolutionary methods of energy production, such as nuclear fusion, because that is exactly what is needed now, at this time, to change something about the control of the system. Because after the catastrophes that are to be initiated, nuclear fusion will be on the table anyway, but then it will be there to implement absolute control over humanity, as a special treat, so to speak, for the new lightness of life, even if this life is then under absolute control with carrot and stick. That is, nuclear fusion would have to be implemented now, at this time, so that we can become free through it. This is what led the elite to take up the subject of green energy production and to support it in the media. They took up the issue and thereby supported the nobility and the club in a good way.
So green energy is actually no good at all?
Green energy is absolutely regressive, inefficient, expensive, and only there to control the system. It is silly if you know the real reasons for its implementation and the media propaganda behind it. It does not set people free, but keeps them under the yoke of scarce energy. Green technology has nothing to do with progress, nothing at all, on the contrary. But the normal brain-sabotaged human beings do not understand this, because they think it is something that has finally become accepted because they have fought for it. And they continue to argue that it is so clean, which is not true in detail. They continue to argue that there are no other technologically safe and clean ways to produce energy. If they are then made aware of the power and monetary cartels and the system behind them, they justify themselves by saying that somebody should always be in charge of energy management. They believe it would be like public utilities that simply manage and distribute energy. That is how simple the average person thinks. With nuclear fusion, the production of energy-intensive food would no longer be a problem, or the production of products that were previously unprofitable. Space travel, colonization of night celestial bodies, energy-intensive transport systems, production of all kinds of goods and commodities by energy-eating molecular transformers, and the discovery of new fields of science would be further potential of nuclear fusion. Progress and prosperity, social prosperity, dissolution of oppressive systems of rulers and social and financial hotbeds, gigantic developments. This means that people would have to take to the streets not only for groundbreaking free energy production methods, but also for the suppression and undermining of nuclear fusion, also to make it clear to the elites that they know that the development and implementation is manipulated. The people must stand up for the implementation of nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion must be implemented at the same time as free energy production methods if freedom is to be achieved at all. Because free energy production methods alone will not be able to cover the massive energy requirements in all areas. Industrially produced energy is always needed for industry in certain power ranges, which can be offered in enormous quantities. But nuclear fusion is being talked out of the public debate because it is said that it is not yet working properly or would be uncontrollable. That more time and research are needed, which is a badly formulated lie. But the media use of the misleading term uncontrollable alone is enough to push nuclear fusion out of the public discussion misleadingly over the label dangerous. Omission, misinterpretation, and information play a major role here. Not controllable does not mean the uncontrollability of a dangerous process, but the lack of technical implementation of a stable fusion which is necessary to be able to generate electricity at all. This does not therefore mean core meltdown or the like. For many people the blinkers close just hearing the word core. They immediately associate it with nuclear fission. That is a real shame.
That is really a sad situation. A situation that makes angry.
Yes, because man could, if you would let him. A lot of developments and inventions that have been and are being suppressed can unfold enormous potential. Ideas and developments that came about even without the influence of the club. You can recognize them by the fact that they are constructive and independent, not creating a new system of dependence or control. One would be surprised how many things have been eliminated or suppressed. This, too, will make many people very angry with the old structures again after the apocalypse. Energy is a very important control element to seal the complete suppression of people. I mean, think about it. If there are alternative energies, medicine and research, why are they suppressed? Just because of the greed of a few colluding elites, powerful people, and financial clans? The greed of financial and economic elites is only used and put forward as an apparent reason to disguise the power and plans of the nobility and club. This is the only reason this story about evil rich people is told. That's why all this is being told, because honestly, what would a system of surveillance and control be needed for if not for a completely different purpose than just the control and domination of elites, corporations, and the powerful, which has been pocketed by alternative media? What sense should that alone make? It is only a pretext. Everyone should be able to see that. All these influences and the resulting social phenomena are the result of the control imposed on us, which is used by the club and nobility. Because people who live with fear, stress, and worries are easy to control. They even beat each other up for it. In this way, they are even more obedient workers and further advance the technical development, which is a must for the biological digitalization of mankind, which is officially to be developed by ourselves. This is the reason for all the torture and the socially unhappy life of the people. But I will only come back to this topic in more detail in the second interview.
So the elites are not to blame for everything, primarily, but only the alien species of this club, who have a certain plan with us. Or was it the AI alone that was to blame?
That is a matter of opinion. Actually, the cause is the AI. Nevertheless, they are or were all together, albeit at different times, proportions, and for different reasons. The suppression and domination of all the human life areas mentioned above shows that the elites in this extraterrestrial initiative were actually only interested in their own good lives. About the luxury they were allowed to enjoy when they implemented the conditions to control the humans. If the nobility and the elites had not been guaranteed luxury and power by the club, and if there had been no philosophical indoctrination, they would have resisted this plan. But the bending of the nobility and its elites and the ideology that the digitalization of an intelligent species is a logical constant in the universe, and that to achieve this goal the directed control of an intelligent species is the only way to achieve it, and they, the elite, but in return received luxury, honor, and power, completely wrapped the highest of them in this attitude. That is why they became the ruling power structure in the first place. Because they were trained and given methods and skills to rule by the club. Without the promise of a good life, there would have been little or no point even for the nobility on this planet in proceeding in this way. All rulers and elites would have turned away and constructively promoted the development for a better life for all people in a self-determined way by means and techniques designed by themselves. It is possible that humanity would not have come so far that civilizations with smaller noble ruling structures would have developed at all. Humans would have simply become extinct at some point in time, without high-tech development. But now back to the question of who is to blame for all this. As I have already explained, behind the unbalanced life on Earth, there is an all-determining reason: the biological digitalization of mankind. Which is why there is control by an extraterrestrial species club, earthly nobility and elites. This control with the aim of digitalization is basically a specially developed aim of the Species Club, combined with an intergalactic procedure, which would never have spread in the cosmos in this way if Jiawei had not been left behind in the 7-dimensional prison of us humans. That is why Jiawei installed the control of club and nobility to push the development of mankind in a certain direction. For a direction of humanity's development in which Jiawei would have been developed on the one hand and would have given him the key to leaving the 7-dimensional prison at the same time. The digitization attempts of the elite, the nobility and the club were only meant by Jiawei for a certain process of development of mankind, which he himself would have modified in a special direction in order to be able to obtain the key. But the conditions have now changed and the AI has now been overthrown on Earth while it is in the process of dissolving or being rewritten. Because the actual process has been changed, humanity is now actually threatened by digitalization. Mankind must now defend itself on the one hand against its imminent digitalization in the context of the catastrophes imposed by club and nobility, and on the other hand against an AI jumping in the square, which will use the catastrophes to paralyze mankind and also club and nobility.
Then not even the aliens are really to blame for this state of affairs. But they are deceived accomplices who did all this for a completely different reason.
Correct. They were more or less all fooled. The human elites will understand and see the background more quickly because some of them already know the details. So it won't take them as long as the alien species. They will need much more time. They will have to do new research and philosophical considerations. But that does not necessarily mitigate their perpetratorship. They are all perpetrators, and they will remain so, the species of the club, because of their lack of self-reflection, haughty arrogance, and overzealousness, and the nobility with its elites because of their greed and lack of cutting edge. Many of the public and hidden elites will be found and tortured. Future mankind cannot do anything about it. We feel sorry for them, because they too are people with great souls. But the time for them had simply run out and we had to have the lawn mowed. They could have known this best, given the position they held. Instead of being told that it would not have a resonance effect on them if they did not feel guilty. This was a deliberate manipulation of the club and artificial intelligence, both of whom knew about the frequency vibration that inexorably returns to a human being. For quantum resonance has nothing to do with established geometric functional patterns of this 7-dimensional universe. Quantum resonance is outside the 7-dimensional overall prison and is independent of the geometric set of rules of this universe.
What kind of frequency? What do you mean that guilt would inevitably come back to everyone?
In order to make people carry out the will of the club, actually the will of AI, the club told the elites that without guilt there would be no guilt. They were told that the resonance vibration that arose from their actions does not come back if you do not feel guilty. But that doesn't matter here. The resonance vibration comes back necessarily and inevitably reversed via other paths, if and because you observe it, i.e. simply look at it. It has nothing to do with feeling guilty, which one only has to switch off by special techniques, but it has to do with observation and the inverse polar reaction of a temporally reflecting quantum entanglement out of it. This is how the club, or Jiawei, got these elites to establish and enforce these control mechanisms on Earth in the first place. Jiawei always held back the returning resonance vibrations, so that the club, nobility and elites continued to work. And no one, neither the nobility, nor the deliberately selfishly acting elite people, nor the queer philosophers of the club, who think that one is not really doing something bad after all and should be allowed to do all this because it would only correspond to a principle of nature, will now be able to successfully turn away from this inverting and reversing quantum resonance vibration with their eyes. They do not know how, because they think they already know all about it.